Vladimir Putin has a growing crisis on his hands, and if you can believe it, it's actually completely separate from the war in Ukraine, though the two do feed into each other and make each other much worse. This is a crisis that I've noticed very few Westerners have even heard of, and those who have heard of it often fail to grasp the full significance. But don't worry, that's why I created this video. The crisis involves a region called Chechnya, which you've probably heard of, and a leader named Kadyrov, who according to most reports is now terminally ill, with his death expected at some point within the following years. He has certainly been preparing things at home in a way that make it look like he's preparing for his own imminent death. And it turns out that this is a major problem for Vladimir Putin, because this is a man who, throughout his rule, has created a lot of grievances in his region, and it leads to questions about his succession, and whether his succession could lead to a civil war in a region that Russia has already, previously had to fight wars over in order to subdue. There's a lot of interesting details about the succession, and I'm going to get into all of them. But before we do that, I first need to talk about why this is so significant, because that's the part I've noticed is so often missed. And what's happening in Chechnya right now is not an isolated crisis. It's actually part of a broader set of crises around the Caucasus mountain range, which is threatening a region that Russia has always considered to be integral. This is a region that throughout its history, Russia has fought many wars over, including a war that lasted several decades during the time of the Russian Empire. It's also a region that Vladimir Putin himself has personally fought wars over, including the Chechen wars in Chechnya, but also the invasion of Georgia. And right now, as this crisis is brewing in Chechnya, on the north side of the Caucasus Mountains, there's an equal crisis, maybe not an equal crisis, but a parallel crisis happening in Armenia to the south of the Caucasus Mountains. That means that right now, with all of this combined, Russia's power in this region is being threatened in a way that it hasn't been threatened in a very long time, and it could easily fall out of Russia's grasp, with a lot of geopolitical implications. And the problem for Russia is that because they're so tied up with their war in Ukraine, they cannot really do anything about it. This Caucasus mountain range, the reason it's so critical is because it controls access basically in and out of this region of Western Asia. It controls access to the country of Iran and also the country of Turkey. And just broadly speaking, it's a region that Russia has always wanted to maintain as a buffer zone. Perhaps less relevant today because nobody's trying to attack Russia despite their paranoia. But from the perspective of Russia, they try to treat the entire world as if they're always going to be attacked. And they consider these old buffer zones of key strategic importance. Just look at Ukraine today, which in a lot of ways has similar geographic logic to the geographic logic behind the Caucasus. From a strategic standpoint, the reason that Russia would want to control Ukraine is because it gives them control of a big flat plain that armies throughout history have crossed over to get access to Russia proper. The idea of controlling Ukraine, and for that matter Poland, for Russia has always been, we want to close that gap as much as possible and get ourselves butted up against mountain ranges that are more easily defensible. Russia has obviously failed in Ukraine, and now they're starting to fail in the Caucasus as well. This could become a huge crisis, and it could become a defining embarrassment for Vladimir Putin, if there are any that are of similar scale to his embarrassment in Ukraine. Indeed, this point should not be missed. When Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, he almost certainly did so at least partially with the hopes that his name would go down in Russian history. The man who reunified former Russian territory and brought it back to its former glory. The man who could rebuild what was once lost. But now it seems more and more likely, because of how miserably he's failed, and because of how weak Ukraine has made Russia, that Vladimir Putin's legacy could be the man who actually managed to lose access to the Caucasus Mountains, which would be truly stunning if indeed it did happen. All of that being said though, despite how significant that is, the significance of Chechnya actually goes much further. Again, Vladimir Putin fought for this territory as one of the defining actions of his presidency, It's one of the things that actually made him so popular in the minds of the Russians in the first place. Russia fought 2 wars over Chechnya. The first one they lost, and that was under Vladimir Putin's predecessor. Vladimir Putin then came in and basically dominated Chechnya, brought them back under control, and that made a lot of people really like him. But the story is bigger than just territorial conquest, because Chechnya is a Russian republic, and that holds a lot of significance. The significance of Chechnya trying to break off, and the reason Russia didn't want it to happen in the first place, and why Russia is afraid of it happening again, is because Chechnya is not the only Russian republic. In fact, they're just one of many different Russian republics, all of which have varying degrees of power and varying degrees of centuries of grievances against Russian imperialism. And the fear is that if one of these republics could break off, others will likely follow. And they may even, to protect their own independence, try to work to support the independence of other Russian republics. That is indeed exactly what happened after Chechnya won their first war against Russia. They started supporting independence of other Russian republics, around the Caucasus in particular, and Russia was terrified of the implications of this. That is why Vladimir Putin worked so hard to brutally put the Chechens down in the Second Chechen War. This then is not just a story about one region. It's a story of a spark that could start a wildfire that Putin has successfully put out in the past, but that Putin no longer has as much power to put out as he once did. Chechnya could be a powder keg just waiting to explode. So hopefully you have a pretty good idea now about why this crisis in Chechnya is so significant. With that in mind, though, the next question is, how likely is all of this to actually happen? Is this a realistic scenario, or is this just kind of hyped up propaganda meant to excite people about a big nothing burger? And that's where things get really interesting. There are a lot of details about Chechen secession, that's a hard one to say, Chechen secession, that are fascinating. And in fact, when you study this, you'll realize this is like Game of Thrones in real life. There is so much human drama here, and as you study this story, you learn so much about history, human psychology, and geopolitics. I just find it fascinating. So that's where we're going to turn next. But as we do that, I first want to interrupt with another story that is relevant to this region. A story that starts in Georgia, right to the south of the Caucasus from Chechnya. It's a story that you can skip if you wish and get right to the next part of the video, but I think you'll enjoy it. So here it is. Now you may be interested in a crazy story that recently started in Georgia. Some of you will know that Stalin was absolutely obsessed with French wine and champagne, and he had a huge collection of it in a private cellar in Georgia. Recently, the Georgian government has decided that they can start to sell off this collection, and due to their age and their story, I hear that some of these bottles are being valued as high as $200,000. That seems crazy to me, but when it comes to wine collections, the story is really everything. And for those who watch this channel, it turns out that Ukraine has much closer ties to this story than you might at first realize. You see, Stalin loved champagne, but at some point, France stopped selling champagne to the Soviet Union, driving Stalin on his birthday in 1950 to order the creation of a Soviet sparkling wine company, in a place that you've probably heard of, Bakhmut, the city that would become the site of arguably the most famous battle of the entire war in Ukraine. Back then, Bakhmut was known as Artemivsk. This town had the deepest wine cellars in the world, 60 acres of wine cellars, 236 feet below the surface of the earth. The perfect place to age a sparkling wine. Eventually, owing to the town's name, this wine became known as Artemivsk wine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this ceased to be a Soviet wine, and alongside the town of Artemivsk, Artemivsk wine became part of Ukraine's national legacy. As Ukraine continued to chart its own path, ultimately, the town of Artemivsk was renamed Bakhmut, and Artemivsk wine came to be known as Art Wine, a truly Ukrainian product. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they waged war over Bakhmut and everything it represented about the new Ukraine. That included Art Wine. a product that had left the grasp of Russia's empire and had rebranded itself, reflecting its new freedom and its Ukrainian heritage. And when the Wagner Group captured Bakhmut in 2023, they also captured the precious stock of Ukrainian art wine, where millions of bottles were stolen or wasted or both. This precious and rare wine, a product of many years of devotion and aging, something that had been improved under Ukrainian ownership, was in many cases used by Russian soldiers to flush their toilets, since in the process of capturing the city of Bakhmut, they had completely destroyed the region's infrastructure. The past of the Russian Empire had returned. But just before Bakhmut was captured, some cases of art wine were taken out of the city by brave Ukrainians who wanted to preserve the legacy of this historic company. I actually have some of those bottles in my hands right now. Bottles which used to number in the millions, but which have now become incredibly rare. In fact, for some variants, like this Ruby Brut that I'm now holding, there are less than 1,700 bottles left in existence. And for other variants, that number is closer to 150. Now that is a story in a bottle if I have ever heard one. The story of art wine is in many ways a microcosm of the story of Ukraine as a whole. A story of attempted but failed Russian dominance over things that are, in fact, Ukrainian. A story of a Russia that still sees everything that was once Soviet as still theirs, when new identities have long since been forged and new futures already carved. In this bottle, which Russia failed to capture, we see a physical representation of Ukraine's fight for freedom and a separate identity and a new future, a future of freedom for themselves. And when we see this bottle, we're reminded that though Russia may try to grab everything within its reach, there are some things that will always remain out of reach from them. Art Wine has a story worth telling, and they have graciously partnered with me to help bring awareness to that story, and have sponsored today's video. So if you want to add this story to your collection, a bottle that sat beneath the feet of Russian soldiers as they waged war against Bakhmut, but that escaped Russia's grasp, you can do so at artwine.com. Artwine has even created a very special bundle in honor of this channel and my viewers, but especially in honor of my cousin, Cruz Brian, who perished on the battlefield in Ukraine fighting against the Russian invaders. And that bundle is the full arsenal, which contains one of each variant that was rescued from the cellars of Bakhmut, including some bottles that have become incredibly rare. Art wine, by its very nature, is obviously a limited product, so unfortunately it's not available everywhere. But it is available in numerous different countries, and I have worked with them to make this available in countries where my audience is asking for it. So art wine is now available in the United States, but also in Europe, including in Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. So if you live in one of those countries, I encourage you to check out Art Wine before the limited stocks sell out in your area. Thanks again to Art Wine for sponsoring today's video. And I know you won't be disappointed having this story in your collection. So now let's get into the gooey details of what's actually going on in Chechnya right now, and why I personally think it's far more likely than not that there will be a big development here in the somewhat near future that is very bad for Vladimir Putin. Again, it has to do with the leader of Chechnya, Kadyrov, and the fact that he has been very ill, with rumors that he is terminally ill. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to think when we say something like that, because there's always rumors of Russian officials being sick and that they're going to croak and die tomorrow and this and that. And I just want to be clear that there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of those kinds of rumors since I started my YouTube channel, and I have never shared any of them because I'm not a rumor mill. But in this case, there's some very interesting details that really supports the thesis. First of all, this man is relatively young, but despite his relatively young age, he has recently started making a lot of moves that show that he is preparing for succession. He has put his children, who are young and inexperienced, in pretty important government roles, or at least more important than they're qualified for, which seems to be a move for him to try to prepare them to take office as soon as possible. He's also started a series of marriages of his children with different officials in Chechnya. Basically strategic political marriages that could protect the family if he passed away and there was a fight for power in the region. These are, of course, the exact types of things that you would expect to see from a monarch or somebody who behaved like a monarch if they expected their death to come soon. And actually, in a place like Chechnya that is defined by blood feuds, there is an active incentive to not do these things unless you really do expect to die. Because once you start doing this, you hint that maybe your death is coming, and you also put in place the infrastructure for potential succession that people can exploit. They can use that against you by getting on the side of the person who's going to be the next boss, things of that sort. There is a reason that throughout history, especially in volatile regions, monarchs have often not named their successors until they were right at their deathbeds, because they understood that by naming a successor, they might as well have signed their own death warrant, or they might have as well set the seeds for future conflict before, they were even out of the picture. This is exactly the type of region that Chechnya is, and we'll get back into that in just a moment. It's a region with massive blood feuds where people are genuinely worried, Russians are genuinely worried, that after Kadyrov goes, there will be a battle for his position. What that battle will look like, nobody knows. This is a particular problem for Vladimir Putin. I've already talked about the war for succession, but you might wonder why that even matters to Putin, and it matters a lot. And it goes back to the Chechen wars and how Russia actually won those wars. So the way that Russia actually won the Second Chechen War, where they had failed in the First Chechen War, was by exploiting Kadyrov's father. And like I said, this is where it gets really Game of Thrones. Kadyrov's father had actually fought on the side of the Chechens against the Russians in the First War. But in the Second War, he decided to defect and switch sides, and started immediately negotiating with Moscow, saying that if he helped them win the war, he wanted some benefits to himself, and Moscow complied. Because he was an insider to that region, because he had fought alongside these men, he was able to actually convince a lot of them to join his side and fight against their fellow former comrades. He also, of course, knew their strategies and tactics, and a combination of all of this helped this man ultimately win. And as he won, he brutally repressed the other clans that were outside of his clan who may have vied for his position of power. He sort of basically used the Russian government as his stepping stool to power for his clan where they otherwise may not have had it. And this shows you that in Chechnya right now, it's not like a unified region that is totally under just one leader. It is a region that already has fought several wars against Russian imperialism in the past, and they have only stopped when they have been brutally put down. But the desire to actually secede is probably still there if they could get away with it. In fact, to defend that thesis, we've actually seen in Kadyrov's rule, under his father's rule, a lot of Chechens fled from Chechnya, and there's a diaspora of hundreds of thousands of Chechens who live outside of the territory to this very day. Now, eventually Kadyrov's father dies, and the man we now know as Kadyrov comes into power, and he becomes Vladimir Putin's pet project. Vladimir Putin has a lot of personal engagement with this man, which is very bizarre for a leader of a Russian republic. In fact, the leaders of the other Russian republics are incredibly jealous of him. But he serves on Putin's behalf so that he can get massive wealth by operating in a region where without him, the old rebellions would probably come up again. There's another reason, too, why the Chechens are more willing to follow a Kadyrov than they would be willing to follow Moscow directly. So Chechnya today operates as a quasi-independent state. Theoretically, they are independent in domestic matters, but they have to work with Russia on international matters, for example, the war in Ukraine. And this is very important because Kadyrov is an Islamist. And one of the main grievances that Chechens have always had against the Russian Empire, or whatever form that takes, is that it's a different religious system that doesn't fit with their system. And under Russian rule, they cannot practice their religion the way they want to, which is Sharia law. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not advocating for Sharia law. I'm just explaining the dynamics of an actual civil war in an actual country and what's driving the individual parties. So people in Chechnya, they want to follow the Islamic religion, and while Kadyrov doesn't go as far as letting them have Sharia law, he does protect Islam to a large degree, and he's built a public persona around that. In fact, there's a famous example of his son actually beating a man, I think while he was in prison, who was imprisoned for burning a Quran, and he was widely celebrated for this within Chechnya for, defending the Islamic faith. So Putin and Kadyrov work at each other's whims and wishes. Kadyrov is clearly subservient to Putin, but Putin needs him to keep control of a region that Russia has always struggled to control. This then is what makes the possibility of Kadyrov being terminally ill so potentially traumatic for Vladimir Putin. This is a man who, over the years, has built up a lot of resentment among the people he rules because he has ruled them through violence and through things that they just don't agree with. Once he is gone and his power is gone, this strongman is gone, people will do what they have always done throughout history, or at least there's a strong chance they will, which is try to step into that gap and try to gain power for their own clan, maybe just for reasons of vengeance, if nothing else. And for Putin right now, he's in a very weak position to be able to do anything about that because Russia is already so weak due to their war in Ukraine. The problem for Kadyrov, though, is that he doesn't have a strong successor to actually take his place. In Chechnya, your successor needs to be at least 30 years old. And Kadyrov's oldest child is a daughter who is 27, not exactly a great candidate because she's a female in that society anyways, and she's still 3 years off. His sons are younger and even less experienced than that, which creates a real potential gap here. Kadyrov is getting sicker and sicker and sicker every single day, while Russia's military is getting weaker and weaker and weaker every single day, while his children are getting closer and closer and closer to being able to take his position, but not exactly quite there to the finish line yet. That is a recipe for disaster with a lot of competing claims for this man's position, and it really could descend into violence incredibly quickly. And that could reboot Chechen independence. That's very realistic. It's not just propaganda. When we look at Russian history and all of the different times that the Chechens have fought for independence against the Russians, it's always become the biggest problem around already existing crisis moments for the empire. So when the Russian Empire fell, when the Tsar was ousted, the Chechens stood up. When the Soviet Union fell, the Chechens stood up. You get the picture. Right now, the only thing that's been holding the Chechens back from independence, or at least fighting for independence, is the idea that they just wouldn't win because their opponents are too strong, they've been subdued. But if all of their opponents are gone, the Russians because of their war, and Kadyrov because he's dead, that really could start up another movement. All of that being said, we're still not done yet, and this is potentially the most interesting piece yet. Because there is yet another spark that makes a potential rebellion in Chechnya in some ways more likely than it has actually been in the past in periods where the Chechens did indeed rebel. And that spark is Ukraine. Not just the fact that Russia's military has been weakened by their war against Ukraine, but actually Ukraine itself. A lot of people don't realize this, but there is actually a Chechen government in exile in Ukraine, in the capital city of Kyiv. And there are a couple of Chechen battalions fighting on Ukraine's side in their war against Russia. And when these people are interviewed, they say that the reason they fight for Ukraine is because they see Ukraine's struggle for independence as one and the same as their own struggle for independence. Now, it is not a bridge too far at all to imagine that Ukraine could use that same logic in reverse, and that if Chechnya was weakened and in crisis, they could actually see the Chechen struggle for independence as one and the same as their own struggle for independence. And there could potentially be some support from Ukraine to Chechnya. Maybe they would go through Georgia, or maybe they would go through Armenia, which I have a whole video on, which is recently coming more and more to Ukraine's side and further away from the Russian side. This could give Chechens the exact thing they need, a state that will actually support them in their fight. And there's really no incentive for Ukraine not to do this. I don't think that anybody would really blame the Ukrainians if they did support Chechen independence in this case. It would obviously be messy afterwards, and there would be a lot of propaganda about how Ukraine was supporting Sharia law and things like that, when in reality it would just be complicated geopolitics of Ukraine during war doing whatever they had to do to defeat a superior foe who wanted to delete their way of life and their independence. But it's still a very, very interesting chip. And it means that the possibility of Chechen independence is not something that we should dismiss, because I promise you, it is not something that Vladimir Putin is going to dismiss. And that is the most exciting thing of all. There are precedents here too, by the way, in recent history. We look at Syria, which is another example of a dictator who was in power because of Russia's ability to protect him with their military and things of that sort, who looked very strong until Russia got weak in Ukraine. And when Russia couldn't support this dictator anymore, the rebellion flared right back up, and Assad fell very, very quickly. Chechnya could be another version of the exact same thing. In conclusion, Russia is facing a massive potential crisis in Chechnya, but it's not just Chechnya, let me remind you. This crisis could easily expand to the North Caucasus, to several different republics, just as it did after the First Chechen War. And right now there is a parallel crisis on the south of the Caucasus in Armenia. That is a whole topic in and of itself that I recently created another video on. So if you found this video interesting, I promise you, you will also find that video interesting, and it will tie together all of the loose pieces. If you enjoy geopolitics and discussions like this that you cannot get on the mainstream media, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a YouTube channel member or a patron to support my work, where you'll also get access to some exclusive Q&As. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video.